Hello everyone, and welcome to the Biblical Bookworm. My name is Elizabeth, and today I'll be talking about the book Made for Love, Same-Sex Attractions in the Catholic Church, which was published in 2017 by Father Mike Schmitz, who is a well-known priest, mostly known for his videos on YouTube on the channel Ascension Presents. In this book, he explains the teachings of the Catholic Church regarding same-sex attraction, and he also gives advice on how to handle certain situations, like, for example, how to respond when you're invited to a gay wedding, or when one of your children comes out as same-sex attracted, or their same-sex partner wants to have a sleepover at your house. Father Mike wrote this book mainly for people who either experience same-sex attraction themselves or for their relatives and friends, but I think that it would be beneficial to read the book for every Christian or Catholic in order to understand what the Catholic Church teaches about same-sex attraction, for example, in order to explain that to others. As always, I will first summarize the content of the book, dividing it into two parts. First, what the Catholic Church teaches on this topic, and secondly, why it teaches that. And at the end of the video, I will rate the book and tell you my opinion on it. So let's get started. Father Mike starts the book by saying that the undertone of Made for Love is what Jesus said to the woman who committed sexual sin in John 8:7. Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And he explains that the topic of same-sex attraction isn't a them-us problem, but that we're all sitting in the same boat because every Catholic is called to chastity. Single people are supposed to wait until marriage, if they marry at all. And in marriage, people have to be faithful to each other. So usually, regardless of one's sexual orientation, every Catholic can have a maximum of one sexual partner throughout their life. While the Catholic Church teaches that same-sex attraction is a disordered attraction, it is by far not the only disordered sexual behavior. Another example would be a husband who desires another woman that is not his wife. The author actually wanted to call the book It Is Good That You Exist in order to remind people that they are not cosmic mistakes, but that they have been created with purpose. And so gay people belong in the Catholic Church. They are not merely tolerated, but they belong there. And Father Mike says that he's looking forward to the day when the Church declares a person with same-sex attraction a saint. He addresses the question whether the Catholic Church is obsessed with sex, and his answer is that lust or sexual sin is not considered the deadliest sin, so the Church is not obsessed with sex. And he quotes C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, who said the following: "Finally, though I have had to speak at some length about sex, I want to make it as clear as I possibly can that the center of Christian morality is not here. If anyone thinks that Christians regard unchastity as the supreme vice, he is quite wrong. The sins of the flesh are bad, but they are the least bad of all sins. All the worst pleasures are purely spiritual. The pleasure of putting other people in the wrong, of bossing and patronizing, and spoiling sport and backbiting. The pleasures of power, of hatred. For there are two things inside me competing with the human self which I must try to become. They are the animal self and the diabolical self. The diabolical self is the worst of the two. That is why a cold, self-righteous prig who goes regularly to church may be far nearer to hell than a prostitute. But of course, it is better to be neither." There is also a chapter dedicated to the question where the teaching about homosexuality is in the Bible. As interpreting rules in the Old Testament is more difficult, the author focuses on the New Testament, where homosexual acts are clearly considered a sin, and here he quotes Romans 1:21-27 as an example. He also explains that the fact that Jesus never explicitly talked about homosexuality does not mean that he approved of it, as that would be arguing from silence, and for example, Jesus also never said that pollution or kidnapping is bad. Here, Father Mike clarifies that God does not judge what we happen to be feeling at the moment, as that will be simply a temptation, which is not a sin, but living out temptations is sinful. The author also warns us of looking for explanations why things in the Bible maybe have not been meant that way, as by doing so, we surrender to God with our words, but not with our actions. The author explains what certain belief systems believe about what constitutes a person, so whether a person is just their body, just their soul, or both. He starts with Hinduism, where he explains that Hindus believe that a person is a soul trapped in a body, and the body is just a vehicle which can be changed and is not part of a person, like a car. Buddhists, on the other hand, believe that the self is just an illusion and that a person is neither a body nor a soul. Atheists have a strictly materialistic view and believe that a person is only their body. Christians believe that a person is a unity of body and soul, and for example, a soul without a body is called a ghost, and a body without a soul is a corpse. And so, as the body is part of a person, according to the Christian worldview, what we do with the body matters. In the next chapter, Father Mike talks about the importance of determining what the nature of a thing is, because without knowing what something is, we don't know how to treat it. The nature of a thing can also be called its what it isness, or at least that's what Father Mike calls it. And the what it isness of a thing can be determined by its what it is forness. For example, a table is to put things on it, while a chair is to sit on it. It is possible to use those things for other purposes without violating their nature, like for example, sitting on a table. The table wasn't made for sitting on it, but we can't sit on it without violating its nature. However, if we use the table as a ramp for a car in order to change the oil of the car, that would definitely violate the nature of the table pretty quickly. And as Father Mike writes, violating the nature of a thing always has negative consequences. Then Father Mike moves on to the what it isness of sex, and first he explains that just because we see animals practice certain sexual behaviors, that does not justify practicing it as humans, because humans are moral agents. For example, there has never been a trial for a monkey or a dog. According to the author, sex has two ends: the complementary union of the couple, which is also called the unitive end, and procreation. He explains that it is possible for a couple to have only one of those intentions in mind without violating the nature of the sexual act. For example, a couple can mainly have the goal of procreation because they're trying to conceive a child, and that's not violating the nature of sex. And also the other way around, a couple can enter into the sexual embrace with the main purpose of intimacy, also in accordance with the nature of sex. But when the couple intentionally wants to prevent one of the ends of sex, they definitely do violate its nature. When a person works against the end of intimacy, in extreme cases, that is called sexual assault or rape. And when they work against the procreational aspect, that is called contraception. And Father Mike argues that doing so violates the nature of sex. Some people might say that sex isn't a big deal, but Father Mike objects that, for example, in the series Law and Order, sexually based offenses were called especially heinous, which indicates that sex is a big deal, as sexual crimes have a greater negative impact on the victims than, let's say, theft. Then Father Mike addresses the issue whether there is objective truth, and he cites a few surveys, of which one has shown that 66% of all young adults, I think in the US, do not know how to make moral decisions and are not even aware of moral dilemmas in their lives. Those people usually make decisions based on their feelings. Another survey, also among young Americans, showed that 94% of them do not believe that there is absolute right or wrong, but Father Mike objects that there are certain issues where most people would agree that they are wrong, and that, for example, would be what the Nazis did, rape, or racism. The author presents a theory why people don't believe in absolute truth these days, and he says that we live in an opinion age because we constantly see bloggers and influencers sharing their opinions, and at a certain point we believe that the only thing that exists are opinions, so subjective truth. Another possible explanation he presents is that although people do realize that there are some moral issues that are absolutely wrong, they deny that truth out of convenience in order to justify their immoral desires. He explains the difference between objective and subjective truth by saying that an example of an objective truth would be a statement about the weather or the speed limit, and an example of a subjective truth would be how you personally like the weather. A statement about God's existence is an objective statement, no matter if one believes that there is no God or that there is a God, because if one believes that there is no God, that is an objective statement, and if one believes that there is a God, that is also an objective statement. Father Mike lists 3 consequences that not believing in God's existence has. Without God, there is no free will, as we would all just be atoms interacting with each other, and he explains that there is a difference between us and things without a free will, as no one would engage in a discussion with a vending machine that doesn't work. The second consequence is that without God there is no right or wrong, and the question is not whether someone who doesn't believe in God can be a good person, as the answer is obviously yes, but the question is whether someone can be good if God doesn't exist. And here the answer is no, because if God doesn't exist, we would be just a cosmic accident, and there would be no right or wrong. People could only do what is useful. And the third consequence is that without God, there would be no meaning. And here he quotes C.S. Lewis, who said, "If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe, and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be without meaning." Father Mike also addresses the topic of gay marriage, and he writes that it doesn't make sense to say that every person has the right to marry if we're not able to define marriage. So he writes about how one could define marriage. He writes that what constitutes marriage is not commitment or love, because, for example, a friendship also is a form of love, but it's not the same as marriage. And also, vowing to hold hands with only one person to the end of one's life is a strong commitment, but it's not marriage. What does constitute marriage is it's the specific human act that results in the biological unity that by its nature, its what it isness, is oriented toward the creation of human life. He explains that love is not a feeling, but an ability. And he also explains that love is not love, because while in English there is more or less only one word for love, the ancient Greeks knew 4 types of love, which I have already made a video about, summarizing the 4 loves by C.S. Lewis. To summarize briefly, the 4 loves are sympathy, friendship, romantic love, and self-emptying love. And Father Mike writes that we were made for love, which doesn't mean that we were made for sex, as there are greater loves. Like for example, in John 15:13, it says, "There is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends." There are essential and non-essential parts of marriage, and Father Mike makes a comparison with a baseball game, where he explains that the size of the baseball field or the number of players are not essential parts of baseball, as they can be changed and it will still be considered baseball. The essential parts are the baseball, the bat, and the rules of the game. He further explains that a football player can join the game and become a baseball player, but she cannot play football and call herself a baseball player. The worst baseball player is more of a baseball player than the best football player. In this sense, a game is not a game. So the essential part of marriage is, quote, "a specific union of hearts and wills culminating in a biological unity that is naturally oriented towards the creation of life. Essentially, marriage is a permanent and exclusive relationship between sexually complementary couples." He then answers a few objections, for example, whether infertile couples can constitute a marriage, and he says yes, because they're still engaging in the act that is by its nature oriented towards the creation of human life. He also answers the objection that marriage changes over time, like for example that interracial marriage was not accepted in the past but is accepted now, and he also talks about polygamy, but I will not summarize those in order to keep this video short. Now let's get to my opinion on the book. As I've said in my video on books by YouTubers, this book was my favorite book by a Catholic YouTuber, and that was mainly because Father Mike spoke with much clarity on the topic and with much compassion. He really tried to make clear what he meant by certain words. He was respectful when he talked about people with same-sex attraction, and he used inclusive language. I also like that Father Mike chose this topic in general, because that was somewhat courageous, as he could have chosen a less controversial topic. This book actually also made me tear up when reading it, because Father Mike explains at some point the breakup story before entering the seminary, and he really just showed how sensitive he is, because he described himself crying and stuff like that, and that really touched me as well. And me tearing up is relatively rare when reading spiritual books, to be honest. And by the way, I will link additional resources by him and other speakers at Ascension Presents on that topic in the description. And I understand that I'm not directly affected by the topic of same-sex attraction, and so I'm not able to rate the book from the perspective of someone who is affected personally by the topic, but I tried to imagine how I would feel if there was a book written like that about topics that I am personally affected by, and so my overall rating of this book is a 10 out of 10. That's been it for today. I hope you liked the video. See you next week. God bless and bye!